Today, the Indigenous communities within Australia mostly live in remote areas as shown by this map. Their cultural identity and health are inextricably linked to the natural environment. Aboriginal spirituality and tradition is centered around the idea that all living things are interconnected and thus the health of the land and water is central to their own health. Aboriginal elder Tom Dystra explains, "We cultivated our land, but in a different way from the white man. We endeavor to live with the land. They seem to live off it." With the British invasion and colonization of Australia in 1788 came large-scale industrialization, deforestation, and land conversion. This development released many tons of carbon into the atmosphere, contributing to the climate change crisis we are experiencing today. Because Indigenous Australians mostly live in remote outback regions of the country, known as Indigenous protected areas, they experience the most extreme impacts of climate change. Rising sea levels and flooding are among the most severe of these impacts, as they threaten to wipe out entire coastal communities. This consequence of climate change is especially threatening to Indigenous groups who live on the Torres Strait Islands, as their communities are the most vulnerable to flooding and infrastructure destruction. To make matters worse, buildings are not fit to withstand extreme weather, and if a disaster were to occur, transportation and communication infrastructure is extremely limited, making immediate assistance nearly impossible. Another impact of climate change is a decrease in rainfall and an increase in drought, which can result in lower crop yields and famine. Those who live in remote communities are directly dependent on the land for their food. The crops that they have grown for many centuries are now struggling to produce in an unprecedented environmental condition brought about by climate change. Additionally, traditional forecasting techniques are failing as the consequences of climate change alter the natural temporal cycles of growth. With European colonization came the introduction of many invasive species into Australia. Climate change will provide the right conditions for some of these invasive species to overtake native species, causing landscape changes and ecosystem imbalance. Human-induced climate change has made wildfires at least 30% more likely to occur due to extreme heat and drought conditions across the country. Meanwhile, Aboriginal Australians are forced to sit idly by while their lands are mismanaged and neglected. The decimation caused by fires deeply impacts the mental and spiritual health of Aboriginal peoples who must live with the trauma of land dispossession, mistreatment, and now catastrophic wildfires that scorch their heritage. Upon reflecting on these extremely hazardous threats to Aboriginal existence, we are left with this question: how do we support a people that is forever attached to a landscape after an inferno tears through their homelands, storm surges and sea level rise wipe out their infrastructure, and invasive species suffocate their ancient trees and destroy spiritual plants and animals? Western science alone cannot address the growing environmental and biodiversity conservation issues in Australia. Given acceptance of climate change as a serious threat to both rural and urban environments, there is an urgent need to mobilize the body of Indigenous knowledge that will assist in reducing the expected negative impacts of climate change, while at the same time recognizing and enhancing Indigenous livelihoods. These collaborative solutions include government-funded, Indigenous-run land management programs to monitor environmental change, revegetate degraded land, and manage invasive species. The benefits of this program would extend beyond increasing employment. They can also lead to a strengthening in cultural practice and improved Indigenous mental health. For threats related to the rising tides, the government needs to provide funding for the redesign of new and existing buildings, as well as higher seawalls to withstand the impacts of extreme weather. These are critical investments that could significantly reduce the vulnerability of coastal Indigenous communities to sea level rise and storm surge. To ensure that Indigenous communities do not face food insecurity due to drought and poor soil conditions, improvements in research and development related to drought-resistant crops and land management is needed. Finally, there needs to be a massive shift in the way Australia prevents wildfires. They need to incorporate Aboriginal land management knowledge to decrease the likelihood of high intensity wildfires. More specifically, the Aboriginal cultural burning practices which maintained the land pre colonization can create fire breaks and reduce fuel loads, thereby significantly reducing the area burnt during uncontrolled fires. For tens of thousands of years, Indigenous Australians managed the land. Their extensive knowledge needs to be utilized in order to remedy the consequences of climate change. However, in such an environment of social inequality, it is imperative that Indigenous resources are used without the ideological and institutional barriers previously put in place that prevented proper and respectful partnerships.